Yeah, or whatever, just do whatever. That's a good way to go. You just,
I mean, because if you try to do it from memory, you might not,
Well, yeah.
you might not say the right things because.
Man, that's kind of a, see, it's, actually, it's not. There's yet to be. Of course, you're going to be looking toward me. Look like toward the chair. I think that's where I'm going to be sitting.
Over here.
Yeah. So it makes you nuts when it's you. I hate that.
I want to get the paper here so I don't have to swish it around.
This is going to need being in the thing here is too much. Yeah, I think that'll be good. So how does that seem?
That seems good.
Pretty good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So why don't we start? If you would just put the paper down for a minute. I'll turn the TV off then, so it's not sort of. Let's just bring this up a little. Bring this in a little bit. And that's good. Is that comfortable?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. To not start with what's in the paper, you can just just make like that's not there. You won't even notice that after a while.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a lot of times you talked about like when you're growing up and moving around a lot of times and all of those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I remember you ever sort of starting back from like as early as you can remember and going forward. And it was interesting when I read through that newspaper article, there were a lot of pieces in there that I knew about, but didn't quite understand how all of them fit together.
Mm-hmm.
So, I know you grew up in Berkshire Heights, or spent like time, you talk about Berkshire Heights. So if you think back to like as far back as you can remember, how far back is that?
Well, I can think back to the farm where I was born. And I was born there in 1920, but I can remember back to 1925 or 26, living on the farm in Rock, Pennsylvania. It's up near Pine Grove. And I can remember of going fishing in the local stream with just a branch off a tree and a string and a hook made out of a safety pin, because we didn't have fishing hooks. And we'd go down and go fishing. And that was, and we also had winters up there that were fairly severe, and we seemed to have a lot of snow. And our farm had several good-sized hills on it. And I remember of going sledding on those hills with my sister Miriam, and the snow was covered with ice, and we'd slide down and cut our fingers and cut our knuckles, and I remember some of those experiences. And I remember riding a horse when I was about 6 years old, and I rode him down to the stream to get a drink, and I had a little stick in my hand, and on the way home I figured I wouldn't need the stick anymore, and I threw the stick away. And he heard the whistle of this stick, and he figured he was going to get whipped, and he took off running. And I had no saddle or anything, just sitting on him bareback, and I had to put my hands around his neck to hold on to get back to the barn. And when we went into the barn, with the top, those doors had the top and the bottom, and the top door was closed and the bottom door was open, he could get under, and I fell off the horse when he went in the stall.
Oh my heavens.
And
Doesn't sound like you fell off. It sounded like you got scraped off.
I think he scraped me off. I never forgot that episode for this horse taking me off his back and me falling. And I remember butchering on the farm. I remember those events. And because we had steers on the farm, and we'd butcher the steers, and we'd also butcher the pigs. And in those days, you'd get a steer in a corner of your barnyard, and somebody would stand up on top of the fence, and you'd hit him on the head with a sledgehammer. That's how you killed your steer, to butcher him. You didn't shoot him in those days. You hit him with the sledgehammer and then butchered him. And I remember helping to butcher the pigs. I'd butcher 1 or 2 pigs, usually 1 pig at a time if it was a pretty big one. And they cooked. We had what they call a summer house where they cook all the meats and make the sausage and the scrapples and all the good stuff they'd make in this summer house, and that would really smell good. And they had a wood stove going, and they'd have a frying pan on there, and we could fry whatever we wanted on this frying pan, fresh from the day it was butchered, so everything tasted very good. Those are some of the events from the farm. And the schoolhouse where I attended the first grade, they built the schoolhouse. My dad gave them a corner of the land, of the corner of the farm, to build the schoolhouse. So the schoolhouse was on our land, so I was able to walk to school every day and walk home.
Yeah, that was nice.
And then after we left the farm, that was in about 1927 and 1928, one of those 2 years, and we moved to Schuylkill Haven. And I went to school in Schuylkill Haven for 1 or 2 years, and then in 1929, I remember that we moved from Schuylkill Haven down to Reading. I remember I was 9 years old, and we moved to Reading, and then we lived in Reading on Pike Street. And my dad got a job in the parish press steel mill. In those days, it was a little hard to get a job, so when he found a job in Reading, well, of course, that's why we moved to Reading, because he had his job in Reading, and he was able to work at the steel mill and stay employed pretty regular, because they were building trucks, and they were making truck and car frames at that place at that time. That was in 1929. And then we lived there until 1931, and that's when we moved to Berkshire Heights in 1931. And my dad bought a small gas station and grocery store in Berkshire Heights on the main boulevard. And we had Gulf gas, I remember the gas, and I was 11 years old then, and I helped attend the gas station and also the store. And when I was 11 years old, and then of course we stayed there, and we were still there when I went into the service in 1940. We still had the gas station and the little store. And I went into the service then from that location in 1940. I entered the service.
I remember one time you were saying that you had 1 or 2 houses that you lived in that caught fire.
A house that we lived in that caught fire.
Burned, was that?
I believe that was her place, your daddy's place.
Okay.
I never recall the one catching fire, no.
Okay, I thought I was mistaken then.
I know the farmhouse that we had over in the farm, we didn't have any insulation, so before the winter came, we'd stack a straw up alongside the walls of the farmhouse. We'd stack them as high as we could, maybe 8-10 feet high, for outside insulation to keep our house warm, because we just had wood stoves. We didn't even have coal in those days. We just had a wood stove to keep the house warm, so we insulated with bales of straw on the outside. And if I recall correctly, I think I slept on a straw mattress. Well, it was just filled with straw, and you just slept on the straw. I don't remember if it was a bed or if we slept on the floor. I don't remember, but I think we slept on straw mattresses.
Imagine that was pretty comfortable, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But for kids, it was a big deal to sleep on a straw mattress. You were very happy with sleeping on the straw. And we had no running water. We had two wells. We had one well for the house that was close to the house, and then we had another well that was out actually in the farmyard and that in the barnyard out there, and that was for the water for the animals. So we had two wells.
Okay.
That way we had, and they were hand dug wells that we used to get the water. And Berkshire Heights is, like I say, was a place I went to grade school in Berkshire Heights. It was Berkshire Heights grade school, and it was we walked to the school and walked back. It was roughly about a half a mile, I guess, each way. And we walked there in the summer and in the winter. You have to walk to school. There was no buses at that time. And I remember the principal of the grade school, his name was Mr. Schweier. I remember that name. And he used to stop at our gas station and get gas, and I'd fill these. He had a Model A Ford, and he was very, very particular, and he didn't want any drops of gas spilled on his paint of his car. His car was always spotless. So I was always nervous when I filled his Model A Ford, because I was afraid I'd drop a couple drops of gas on the paint of his car, and that wouldn't be good to drop gas on your principal's car.
Sure.
So I didn't always relish him pulling up for gas, because I was afraid I wouldn't do it right when he'd pull up for gas.
So you were saying up to like 1940, I think, when I interrupted you?
In 1940, yeah, then I figured, according to the outlook of the international situation, I figured it looked like that we might be having a war shortly, and I figured I was at the age where I would be drafted into the service. So I figured maybe if I would enlist into the service, it seemed like everybody in those days were more patriotic than what they were in later years. So I figured maybe if I'd enlist in the service, I'd have a better chance of getting what I wanted to have, and I wanted to be in the Air Force rather than in the infantry or in the Navy. I figured that the Air Force was the better place to be. So I volunteered for the Air Force in November 1940, and first location was Langley Field, Virginia, and that's where we took our basic training. And after we finished our basic training, then you were assigned to a base job, whatever you'd give your preference, but wherever they needed you, where they put you. But if you had a preference and they were able to put you there, so I asked to be in the refueling department where you could refuel the airplanes and and gas. And also I was assigned to fill the oxygen tanks, so that for the airplanes for high altitude flying. And we made our own system there to fill the oxygen tanks for the airplanes. And I remember helping to build out the copper tubing and all kinds of fittings and so forth. We built a complete oxygen tank filling station at Langley Field, Virginia. And then we were sending these planes over to England under a Lend-Lease kind of deal, where the planes would go over to England. And they'd be sent to Newfoundland, and there they'd be gassed up and also would be serviced with oxygen. And so they sent myself and one other man up to Newfoundland to set up this oxygen refilling station, because we already had worked on it at Langley Field. So we were sent up there in 1940, I guess it was. So we were supposed to be up there just 3 months temporary duty, and then after 3 months we were supposed to come back and rotate back to the States, and then someone else would go up. But while I was up there, before we were coming sent back, while Pearl Harbor developed, and our time was extended to 1 year instead of 3 months. So we I stayed up at Newfoundland for 1 whole year. But then while I was up there, I also job was expanded to service the airplanes with gasoline and with oxygen. So we serviced the planes up there with 8,000-gallon tankers. We didn't have underground storage. Langley Field, we had underground storage for gasoline. Up in Newfoundland, everything was serviced by tankers. So we drove the tankers to the airplanes and then gassed them up out in the flight line. And at that time, they were sending 4-engine bombers over to England for under the Lend-Lease system, and I sort of liked the idea of these airplanes flying over there, and it looked like a pretty good thing to be flying these airplanes, and I thought maybe I might like it. So then when I finished my year's duty up at Newfoundland, why I was sent back to first place I was sent to in the United States was Bangor, Maine, and
That's cold too.
Yes, it was cold, so I was pretty well used to it after being in Newfoundland for a year. I didn't mind the snow and the ice at Bangor, Maine. So then I took the examination at Bangor Air Force Base, and the examination to enter the Air Force Cadets. So you had to take a written examination, and if you passed that, then you was given a physical examination. I passed that, and then we were sent to begin the cadet training and that was at Alabama, Montgomery Air Force Base in Alabama, and then again that was 8 weeks of just book work. You just had all kind of tests, and you had to learn all the basics about flying, and you sort of got discouraged because you did all paperwork and didn't see an airplane. You didn't get to see an airplane or fly an airplane. It was all book work, and of course calisthenics and exercises, and you think, oh, am I ever going to see an airplane? But after a while, you finished your 8 weeks of basic training, and then you went to your airport, where you finally got to see an airplane and learn to fly an airplane. Mm-hmm. So it was primary training. You took your book work in the morning, and then in the afternoon you were able to go out in the flight line, and the instructor would go over the airplane with you, show you all the different parts, and then eventually you got to take a flight with your flight instructor. And he'd take you up and give you what they call an orientation ride. He'd fly you around, show you the terrain, and let you. It was a dual control. You sit in the back, and it was an open cockpit airplane, and you would sit in the back, and he would sit in the front, and he'd let you move the controls and so forth, and then he'd bring it down, land it, and that was a big deal to have your first airplane ride in an open cockpit airplane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess, how fast did they go? The cockpit.
It's an open cockpit airplane, and you wore a helmet and the glasses and the scarf, and like you see pictures of the regional first pilots. That's the way you flew. It was an open cockpit, and you talked through what they call a Gosport. It was more or less just a rubber tube that went up to his ear, and you talked through it back in your cockpit, and that's the way you could converse. You didn't have radio equipment of any kind, and I guess we had an airspeed indicator on them, and an altimeter. You only had a few basic instruments: the airspeed indicator, altimeter, and then things like oil gauges and stuff like that. But I think you had very few instruments on the airplane. You fly mostly, like they say, by the seat of your pants, by the feel of the airplane. And of course, then you had basic maneuvers. You had a master. You had to do what they call a figure eight. That'd be like you'd pick out maybe a tree on the ground or a telephone pole or something. You'd have to do a figure eight around this tree, and he'd do it and show you how to be done, and you try it, instead of a figure eight, you'd make a mushroom out of it or something. And you think, well, that's easy to make a figure eight around a telephone pole, but you'd either slide in or slide out, or it never seemed like it was a nice figure eight like he would make. But you had to do that. And then they did what they call S's across the road. You'd pick out a road and you had to make an S back and forth, left and right, left and right. And you had them have the same distance on both sides. So, you know, to make a nice S to cross the road. So that'd be another maneuver you had to do. Those were basic maneuvers. Then eventually you had to do, stalls, you had to do spins, and you had to do loops with this airplane. And basic maneuvers that this airplane had enough power to do it. It wasn't real powerful, but you could do mostly loops and spins and stalls with it. Oh, and forced landings, he'd cut the engine off, and then you'd have to pick out a field where you were going to land the airplane. And he'd have the engine cut off until you were down pretty close to the ground, and when he'd see that you were going to be able to make a safe landing, then he'd put the engine back on again for you, and you'd fly back up.
What if he saw you weren't going to make a safe landing? What did he do?
He'd make you practice a couple more then. You'd have to keep, in other words, if you could do a couple in a row that were good, then you finish that phase. If you come in across high tension wires or you stalled out before you got over the field, well, then he'd say that was no good. You'd have to do some more.
Okay, so then that was the basic stuff that you did there. You know, the basic maneuvers and so on. And then what was next?
Well, then after, he was the most strict instructor that I had all the time. He's a very, very strict instructor, and his motto was, if you passed him, you would graduate. In other words, if you got past him, you didn't need to worry about graduating. He wouldn't. If in other words, if he thought you couldn't make it, he'd wash you out right there.
What was his name again?
Fritchie.
Fritchie.
I don't know if I remember his first name. And he was from, I believe, Clinton, New Jersey. I believe is where he was from. He was he had his own private airport, his own private airplane. He had his own business. But he was like brought into the service to teach pilots because they needed seasoned instructors. He was about 35 or 40-year-old man. He was excellent. He just knew just about everything there was to know about an airplane. He was very, very good. But he was also very strict, and he made you do exactly right. He wouldn't take half and had to do right, or else he'd just wash you out. So he washed about half of them out always in his class. But he said the ones that didn't wash out, he was almost always would graduate. They'd make it through the rest of the training.
Okay, so then what was after that?
She'll get me some water.
Break here?
Yeah, my throat's getting dry.
Okay.
But I want to take a little break, my throat gets dry.
Okay.
Maybe if I stop talking, then you can just ask some questions and.
Yeah, that's hard. That's hard to do because you'll do most of the talking anyway. Even if I ask.
Yeah, but it gives me a little break while you're talking, while you're asking the questions, you know.
Yeah, I think it will be good. Okay, you want to get restarted?
Okay.
Okay.
Now you got to. Let's you press.
No, I'm okay. We're all set. So you were saying you were talking about. Was it Fritchie?
Yeah, his name is Fritchie, and like I say, they're very strict, and if you made him, when we were up flying, if he tell you to do something, and if you didn't do it right, like we were doing the figure eights, and you didn't do them right, he'd get mad, and he'd take the plane, he'd turn it upside down, and fly along upside down, and he used to say he'll let some brains run into your head to see if you could do a better job. That was his expression. I'll let some brains run into your head. Let some brains run into your head, then turn you back over and then tell you to do it over again. And by that time, you were able to do it pretty good. And he was, like I say, he was, but then by the same token, you did a good job with him because you knew it had to be right, or he wouldn't accept anything less than right. Mm-hmm. And it was a funny thing. Another student and myself, we were sort of getting to the point where we didn't know if we could make it, and we thought, you know, maybe we couldn't make it, and he was up flying with another student, and we decided when he comes down, we were going to tell him, well, we don't believe we can make it, we think we'll quit. And when he came down and landed with this student, the student hit the brakes too hard and nosed the plane up on the front, nosed the plane upside down. It landed on the nose and went on around, and the plane landed out in the runway upside down. And the student was too scared. He was hanging on his safety belt. Well, the instructor, he wanted to get out of the plane fast. He opened his safety belt and fell out in his head. the student, he was too scared. He didn't do anything, so he was hanging there. He didn't get hurt. The instructor fell out and hurt his head because they were open cockpits and they were upside down. And anyway, when they came in, well, we said to each other, well, we can't tell him to quit now. He figured we were scared because he turned the plane upside down, so we can't tell him now. So that one accident saved us, because after that we didn't tell him. And then eventually, we finished the course and graduated from his school and kept right on going. But that little accident, I guess, kept us on going. We never did decide after that we were going to quit. From then on, we figured we could make it. After we finished his school, then we were transferred to basic training. That was another airfield where we flew a single-engine airplane, but it was more powerful and bigger, and it was more maneuverable, and also you could fly nights with this airplane. It had more gauges and instruments, and you'd also learn to do night flying with this. And it seemed like it was a tremendous big airplane. It had a big engine on it compared to this little engine on the PT-17. This was called a BT-13, a basic trainer, and a lot more noisy and heavier, but it was faster and everything. So what we did mostly in this airplane was just refine what we did in primary training, except that with this one here, we learned to fly nights with this plane, and that was more or less what you learned in basic training, just more of the same things, but you did things in a faster airplane, plus you did night flying with it. And then from then, after you finished basic, then you had to decide whether you wanted to be a fighter pilot and go to single-engine fighter training, or if you wanted to be a bomber pilot or a transport pilot and go to twin-engine and four-engine training. So I wanted to be a transport pilot, so then they sent me to Blytheville, Arkansas, where we were able to learn to fly twin-engine airplanes. That was airplane with two engines on, and then of course you learned formation flying at advanced, and you also learned instrument flying, where you flew instruments. They put a black hood over the front of the airplane, and all you see was your instrument. You couldn't see outside, and you had to completely fly with instruments only. You weren't allowed to look outside, and you had to be able to navigate what they call a triangle course, 3 different points, and then fly back again on instruments. And then of course your instructor pilot was the side of you to make sure that you come back okay and everything. So, and then of course you did formation flying in days. You learned formation flying in days there, and then you also learned formation flying at night in that airplane. And of course you had to learn always night flying, night landings, and night takeoffs, this airplane.
Imagine the takeoffs wouldn't be so bad, but the landings probably would be. Sounds like that'd be quite a challenge. I mean, takeoff, you just, go down the runway and off it goes, but.
Yeah, the landings at night, of course they have the runway lights on, and really, I really enjoyed the night landings as much as the day landings, because it was, it was more of I don't know how you might say it. It was more of a satisfied feeling when you could come out down there at night and land in that runway and just touch down and just roll to a stop in the dark, you might say, and it just gave you I don't know, a satisfied feeling that you could come down and land. And when you were up there at night in the sky and you come down and you felt the earth, it gave you sort of a warm feeling to be back on the solid earth again and safely. You know, you make a good landing. And it was always a certain amount of satisfaction when you could make a good landing at night and then roll to a stop and then taxi off. You felt sort of like you had your mission accomplished after you did a good landing at night.
Was that formation flying at night?
Formation flying at night was probably the most difficult thing to master, because you had to fly within inches of the other airplane. Because if you got out too far, then you couldn't judge your spacing, your distance anymore. You were too far. You had to stay close so you could. The closer you stayed, the more accurate you could judge your position. And yet you had to keep away from hitting. You didn't dare to hit the other airplane's wing. So at night, it was very demanding flight to fly, formation flying at night. But
watch the other wing. Is that what you looked at? The other wing, I guess.
Each wingtip had a little light on it, and you gauge yourself by the little green light on the wingtip, and you'd put your wing right as close as you could to the wingtip. Actually, your wing was inside of the other plane's wing, a certain amount.
Overlapped a little bit.
Yeah, and then you'd always fly a little bit below his wing, I believe it was. You'd fly like a couple feet below his wing, but you'd actually be inside his wing, but you'd be below it. So in case he would drop back or you would go too fast, you wouldn't hit his wing, you'd go under it.
Did anybody ever hit while they were doing that? Or not?
Yeah, they had a fair amount of accidents at night formation flying where they'd hit. But actually night landing, they had, I believe, more accidents flying at night landing than, for some reason or other, that we had several planes that landed on top of each other at night, which shouldn't be, but for some reason or other, of course, there were pretty many planes flying at night. You maybe have several dozen up there flying at night, and they'd come in there every couple minutes, and some reason or other, the planes would. Of course, in those days, you didn't have your communications like you have today. In fact, some places we were flying with no communications. We just come in on visual. You know, you'd see another plane, you'd follow him in.
Yeah, how'd you decide who went first and who went?
Well, whoever was in front, you'd give the guy whoever's in front, you'd just fall behind him. But that's what happened sometimes. They didn't see the guy in the front, and you were thinking you're falling behind him, and where you were actually landing on top of him. And we had that happen several times. One plane landed on top of the other one.
Yeah, that'd be pretty bad. And were they usually fatal accidents then? Not so bad, or?
Sometimes they were, and sometimes they lucked out that they weren't fatal, but some of them were fatal. We had one weird accident, I remember, in twin engine, where a guy's engine quit, and it was at night, and he just slowly left the plane down, and somehow or other he landed in a big open field and landed just like he would on an airfield, completely in the dark, and got out in the wing, got his radio, and called back to the home base and said he had a forced landing out in the field, they should come get him. And nobody was hurt, and they came out with trucks and got him, took him back to the airfield. That was that was rare. That was just one of the rare ones. We had several that crashed at night, and of course they were killed crashing at night, where he usually didn't survive that. He's the only one I remember that was that lucky that he landed and wasn't hurt at night. And usually the accidents were so close to the ground that you didn't have time to bail out or anything at night, because everything was being done close to the ground, so you didn't have any parachute room.
Yeah. Well, then, after you finished up, how long did that training lasted? Several weeks?
8 weeks.
8 more weeks.
Yeah, each place was 8 weeks. Each school.
Okay. Then what was the next school you went after that? Or?
After you finished your training at the twin engine school, well, then that's where you got your wings and that's where you got your commission. In other words, Blytheville, Arkansas, October 1943. You got your wings as a second lieutenant, and you got your commission as a commissioned officer, and then they wanted to know if you wanted to go and fly combat missions over Europe or Japan or wherever, or if you wanted to fly transport airplanes. That's, you fly cargo and passengers and so forth. So, or if you wanted to be an instructor pilot, you decide which one you wanted to do. Now, you didn't always get what you applied for, but you applied for what you wanted, and then if they had openings there, well, then you would get what you applied for. So I applied for flight instructor school at Randolph Field, Texas. And I think they only needed, I don't know, it was only like 5 or 6 or something like that they went to the flight instructor school, and I was able to get what I asked for, and then of course I got married in October 1943, and then I was able, and incidentally, you had to be single when you're taking training. You weren't allowed to be married. But then after you became an officer and graduated, then you were allowed to get married. So then we got married, and then I was sent to Randolph Field, Texas, and that's where they had the flight training school to become an instructor pilot. And I think that was another 8 weeks of training out, either 4 weeks or 8 weeks, I'm not quite sure. Maybe that was only 4 weeks out there. But that was all training to become an instructor. And you had to take all courses in the morning, and then you took your flight training in the afternoon.
So that was pretty interesting then, learning how to be an instructor? Or?
Yeah, that was Randolph Field was an old field, and it was a very, for that particular time, it was a very modern, and it was a very up-to-date airfield. Buildings were permanent, brick buildings permanent, and I remember the food out there was out of this world. They had the best coconut cakes out there I believe I ever ate in my life. The officers' food was excellent out there, and the training was good. They had very good training at Randolph Field. It had a very good reputation in those days for training and equipment and food and your quarters where you stayed. Everything was very good.
Then when that period was over, then you trained people there. That was where they did the instructing right away?
No. Well, once you finished that, then you were sent to one of the air bases to train new students, and I was sent to Stuttgart, Arkansas. That was where that's the first air base I went to train students. There I trained just advanced students. In other words, I didn't train basic or primary students. I only trained twin engine students that were ready to get their wings. So in other words, when you gave them 8 weeks of training, and then those 8 weeks were finished, then they would be ready to get their wings, and then they would fly. Then they would go usually they went over to Europe for bomber training. Most of our students went over to Europe for bomber training.
So the instructing that you did, was that on the flying more, or the theory, the paperwork side, or some of both? Or?
Well, you did both. In the morning, you would do the paperwork. You would do teach them how to navigate and how to learn to fly instruments, and also you had courses on the airplane, the engines and hydraulic systems. You had to learn all about the airplane, all about navigating, and all your groundwork you learned in the morning. Then in the afternoon, then you would take them up for, each student got an hour. You had I guess we had 6 or 8 students per instructor or something. Anyway, you'd take them up for about an hour and a half per student, and you give them first, of course, the beginning, you teach them to fly the airplane first. You had to teach them to fly the twin-engine airplane. And then after they learn to fly the airplane, then of course you teach them to fly the instrument flying, and you had to teach them to fly formation flying in the day, and you also had to teach them to fly formation flying at night. They had to be a proficient pilot when they left there, so they could go into combat. They were ready. After they left there, they were supposed to be sent over for combat training. Usually went over to Europe to fly bombing missions over Europe, because this was 1943 and 44. This was 44, so they were, at that time, we were really bombing Europe, and they were sending the pilots over there to do this mass bombing of Europe at that particular time. They needed all the pilots they could get.
Okay. So then how long did you instruct there? For like a year or less than a year?
We were there roughly about a year at Stuttgart, Arkansas. That would have been, I was sent there in 1944, and then in the late part of 1944, the early part of 1945, it looked like we were winning the war over in Europe, and they felt as though they didn't need quite as many pilots. So what they were doing, they were closing down these bases that where they were teaching pilots, and they closed one base down, then they contract that, close that base, and they go to another base, they close that down. And we're actually closing down the bases because they need less and less pilots. So I was sent from Stuttgart to an air base in Indiana, and then I think I only taught 1 or 2 classes there. Then they closed that base down, and they'd send you to another base. I think I was sent to 3 different bases, and then they finally closed the last base down. And I think by that time we had finished the war in Europe, and they had after we won the war in Europe, well, then they didn't need any more pilots over there. So then what they did, they took all the instructor pilots and put them in 4-engine bombers, and they were going to use, and we went to B-24s. They were going to use these pilots and the airplanes to bomb Japan. They were going to do massive bombing on Japan so that we could end the war in Japan. So most of these instructor pilots now were being trained as bomber pilots and I was sent to B-24 bomber pilot, and I just pretty well completed my training. I was getting ready to be sent over to Japan, and then they dropped the atomic bomb in Japan, and then of course none of us ever got over to Japan.
Okay. So then the war ended, and then you went into the reserves at that point?
Well, the strange part of it was when I volunteered, I entered at Langley Field, Virginia, and when the war ended, I happened to be back flying B-24s at Langley Field, Virginia, getting ready to go over to bomb Japan. So they had so many people that everybody wanted to get out of the service now because the war was over and everybody wanted to get out and go home. So they couldn't discharge everybody at one air base. So what they did, they sent so many thousand to each air base so that they could discharge them from the service in a more orderly fashion. So I was sent from Langley Field, Virginia to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to be separated from the service. And it was cold. I guess it was December, in around there in 1945. We were sent to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was cold and snowing, but we didn't care because we were getting ready to get out of the service. Yeah. So that's where I got separated from the service. But I wanted to stay in the service because I liked it, and by that time, I had several years of the Air Force, and I was a commissioned officer and everything. So I wanted to stay in the reserves. So then when I got separated, I signed up to stay in the reserves, and we were sent back home. But I was able to fly out of the Reading Airport and fly out there once a month, and then stay current that way by flying once a month to an airplane out of the Reading Airport, which was close to home.
Okay. So then you say you were flying once a month, but you were discharged, and you were starting to to, starting up your business in, or you did a couple different things?
Well, what we did, we flew once a month out of the Reading Airport to keep what they call keep your flying time current. You had to fly a minimum of 4 hours a month to keep your flying time current. And then you would also take 2 weeks a year to go away on active duty. You had to do that to stay current in your reserves. So we take 2 weeks active duty and then fly once a month at the Reading Airport. And then eventually they transferred us down to Newcastle, Delaware. At the Reading Airport, we just had AT-6s. That was just a single engine plane that we flew out of Reading Airport just to keep our flying time current and keep our flying skills current. But then when we were transferred to Newcastle, Delaware, they had twin engine airplanes down there. They called a C-119 transport. So we were able to fly twin engine transport planes down there, which were much larger and more sophisticated airplanes than the BT-30 and the AT-6 airplane, which we flew out of the Reading Airport. So I flew out of Newcastle, Delaware for several years. In fact, I guess I flew out of there up until 1951, and then when the Korean War the Korean War was started, and then being in the reserves, they called all the reservists back in for the Korean War. So I was called back in right away, and I had to go up to Westover Field, Massachusetts to serve. And I figured during World War II we were moved around to so many different bases, and it was always hard to get a place to stay, an apartment. So when I was called back in, I figured I'd buy a mobile home or a trailer and then take that up to Massachusetts, and I'd have a place to stay. So we bought a brand new house trailer, hooked it on my car, and took it up to Westover Field, Massachusetts, where I was stationed. And the funny part of it was the whole Korean War stayed at one place, never moved.
And it worked.
Yeah. So instead of hunting around, I thought I'd have a way to stay put, and I stayed put too. So we stayed in the one trailer the whole time, which was nice, and then I didn't have to move around.
You were instructing then?
Yeah, what I did, as soon as I was recalled and was sent to Westover, Massachusetts, they were bringing in what they call recalled pilots. They were bringing pilots back in, but they didn't fly since World War II, so they weren't current. And my job there was to bring these pilots up to current flying status. In other words, we were flying twin-engine airplanes there, and we had to bring these what they called recalled pilots back in and take them out on flights and orientate them and get them current in an airplane so they could fly the airplanes by themselves again. So that was the job that I did there for, I guess, roughly about a year. And then after we had enough recalled pilots, and they received 4-engine airplanes there, C-54 4-engine transports, and then I was assigned to flying cargo and passengers up to Thule, Greenland, where they were building, supposed to be a secret air base up there in Greenland to monitor the Soviet planes and Soviet activity from this Thule air base. But the Thule air base was just under construction, so what we did, we flew the workers up there in the early part of the year, usually about April. We'd fly the workers up, and then we'd have to bring them back in the fall, about October, because it was too cold to work up there in the winter. They couldn't hardly do anything, so we'd fly them up in the spring and then fly them back in the fall. And then also during the whole year, we'd fly supplies up there to them. We'd take supplies up and then unload them and then come back and take another load of supplies up. We flew supplies up there all summer long for them.
Mm-hmm. And that was until you recalled, did you say in 51?
Yeah, that was in 1951 to 1953.
53,
okay. And
well, the 4-engine planes that you were flying at the end of World War II, I imagine they were a big difference. It'd be B, what was it 29 or 24?
The B-24 was the last four-engine plane that flew in World War II. It was a four-engine airplane, B-24. Those were the newest planes that they had at that particular time. Well, they had the B-29s too, but we didn't get into the B-29. It was a different squadron. Our squadron had all B-24s. But then the C-54 was more or less a workhorse for carrying cargo at that particular time. Now they made one much larger than the C-54, but I was just about getting ready to check out in that, and then the Korean War ended, and then when the war ended, then I went back into the reserves again. I didn't stay active, but the active duty pilots, they were able to fly this new airplane that they brought out, and that was much larger than the C-54, but I never got to fly that one.
Which one was that? Do you remember?
I don't know if that was called C-15. It was C for cargo. It might have been a C-15. But it was a tremendous big airplane compared to the C-54. I mean, they could drive a bus up the ramps in the back and drive one or two buses right in the airplane, and then they could put tanks in it, a couple tanks and guns and cargo. It was a very big airplane.
Yeah, that sounds big. And then when the Korean War was over, then you went back to reserves.
And the Korean War was over. I went back into reserve. We just flew again, 4 hours a month, 4 hours a week, and then two weeks a month we go on active duty. And some years I'd take more than 2 weeks. If they had special active duties, sometimes I'd take 4 weeks in a year instead of 2 weeks. If they had available space and so forth, well, you'd maybe get an extra 2 weeks in a year. And that all added up to your points. The more points you had, it would affect your pay when you retired. So the more points you had, the better it was as far as your pay was concerned. You had to have a minimum of 20 years service to retire, and that 20 years could be active and reserves. It didn't need to be all active. You could just so it was 20 years total.
See where we are here. Okay, we have about 5 minutes. About 5 minutes left yet. Then the tape's going to run out. So that went from as far back as you can remember up until the mid-50s, I guess.
Yeah, we flew. Then after the Korean War, well, then we were transferred to Willow Grove, and we took our reserve. We took our weekends we flew out of Willow Grove for our reserve training, and we would go on. I remember we took 1 2 week train. We flew C-119s there, and we also flew C-46s, which was another twin-engine cargo plane. And C-46 was mostly used for dropping parachute troopers.
You had pictures of that. That's a flying boxcar?
Yeah, it was. Well, the C-119 was called a flying boxcar because it was square like a boxcar. They called it flying. The C-46 was actually a troop carrier. It was used in World War II to drop paratroopers, and we flew that out of Willow Grove, and I know I had one summer training encampment where we flew the C-46s, and that whole 2 weeks we dropped parachute troopers down we went to the Carolinas, and all that whole 2 weeks we just dropped parachute troopers, and that was pretty good experience because up until that time I had never dropped parachute troopers. Right down there, that's all we did for 2 weeks. So it was quite an interesting 2 weeks to drop them out and watch them land and come back again to the base, and we'd take another group up again. They'd drop out. We dropped quite a few hundred parachute troopers. There was 2 weeks, and we didn't have any fatalities or any accidents in those whole 2 weeks, which was very good.
Yeah, that was good.
And sometimes we'd even fly them in, some missions we'd fly formation, where it would be several planes flying formation and they'd all drop them out at the same time. And it was really a sight to see all these hundreds of parachutes going down at one time. It was a nice experience to watch that happen.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to stop here and then maybe start here then the next time. And that'll be after you have your operation. You want to say anything about that before we got another minute or two yet?
Well, the only thing is, I've got to stop now because tomorrow is Valentine's Day and I have to have my heart fixed on Valentine's Day, which is something different. And I need a bypass, three bypass operation, and also a heart valve replaced. So tomorrow, which is the 14th of February, 1996, I go into the hospital, and then the 15th, the next day, is when I'm supposed to have the surgery in the Reading Hospital. So hoping everything turns out all right. And
then when will you come back?
And with a double operation like this, it takes about 10 days before you're released. If you just have a bypass, they usually 5 to 6 days. But with the heart valve also, well, then they usually keep you in the hospital up to 10 days maximum if everything goes all right. That's an approximation.
Okay. Well, maybe sometime shortly after you get back, we can sort of pick up from here.
Yeah, I'd be glad to, because all I have to do is sit in a chair for a couple of weeks, so I'll be glad to sit in the chair and talk.
Talk, huh?
That's about all I'll be able to do for a couple of weeks.
Stock up on magazines or whatever, put the TV in your room.
Well, Tess has some puzzles she said she's going to put out here and have me do puzzles for a couple of weeks. So
Jigsaw puzzles.
the jigsaw puzzles, so that'll be a change.
Yeah, that'll be pretty good. That'll be good. So, okay, well, why don't we call it quits for tonight then, and we'll sort of pick up from here.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed talking, giving my experiences. Weren't too wonderful, but they were something that happened.
Well, they're very interesting. They're very interesting.
Is it all?
Yeah.
Yeah, you make history.
Well, like when you do it again, you just went all military. You did say we got married, but then like when you came out of the World War II, then we bought a home and we had a baby. We had Gary.
Talk about that the next time.
Yeah, you could bring that in,
I'm
yeah.
saying he should go